Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're diving into the history of the national political conventions in the U.S. They're a big part of our political process and have evolved a lot over the years. Ben and I will explore how they began, how they've changed, and maybe even talk a little about my disdain for political parties. From the warnings of our founding fathers about those parties, to the modern-day spectacles of balloon drops and celebrities, there's a lot to uncover about how we choose our presidential candidates. You ready for this one, Ben?
Let's roll.
All right. So these past couple weeks, I guess past month, we've had both the DNC and the RNC, the Republican and Democratic National Conventions, and Ben and I, of course, watched all 87 straight hours of them live, right? I mean, we definitely did that.
Oh, yeah. I live for nothing more. It's like my Super Bowl. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Yes, to be clear, both of us watched some of the episodes, and when I say episodes, it makes it sound like a sitcom, which would probably be more interesting.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
Quick, we love to do the trivia stuff, but has it always been a multi-day event?
You know what, Ben? You're going to skip right to one of my fun facts that I don't know if I told you I was going to do at the end of the episode, but
I figured you would.
Yeah, I know they basically start out different times and they had different lengths. I actually don't know. I never saw one from my research that had a one-day convention, but I'm sure probably one of those third-party conventions had it. But Ben, we're ruining one of the fun facts, but I'm going to do it now.
Let's do it.
The longest ever convention.
No, I have no idea, but I would say it has to be back in the day. Well, I was thinking about that when we were like, hey, has it been multi-day or one day? I'm sure it's been multi-day because it took everybody so long to get there back in the day.
That's true.
Like they're riding horses and trains and stuff.
Yeah.
They're like, listen, it took me like 3 days to get here, so I want at least 3 to 5 days. So I'm going to say it was like the Bull Moose Party or something like that. I don't know.
Interesting. It was 16 days. I think you had the right time frame here. It was 1924. It was the Democratic National Convention. It was at Madison Square Garden in New York. A little bit past, they had vehicles at this point, but
Yeah.
they had 103 ballots that they needed to nominate John W. Davis as their presidential candidate, and it lasted 16 days by the time they got through all of those ballots. It's 16 days of voting. Actually, now that you mention it, I wonder if that's one of those things where they just kept saying, you know what, I don't really want to go back home right now. Let's go 10 more votes. Let's just tie this thing up.
Yeah, I've been fighting with my significant other. I don't really want to go back yet. Let's.
Yes.
I gotta stay here. We gotta count the votes again. Long day at the office.
Yeah, I'd love it if politicians in 1924 said significant others. I'm sure that was probably at the top of their mind.
I know it was all wives.
The old battle axe. Just to be clear, I don't use that term, but I'm sure that's what they used back then. So
It's a great Norm Macdonald reference there. Yeah.
Oh, man. Yes. We should pour one out for Norm and then continue the episode. One of the greatest comedians of all time.
Controversial and hilarious. But anyone who, that's sort of how that works. Yeah.
Yes.
But yes,
100.
absolutely. He's the comedian's comedian.
Yeah. So, Ben, do you want me to go over some brief history of these conventions?
Yeah, let's go for it, Ray.
All right. Well,
Trust your historical purview, whatever it would be.
I trust both my purviews and my overviews typically, so that's good. We're on the same page here.
I'm going to look up purview names again. I totally threw that in there.
So 1796, this was before conventions. The candidates were picked by congressional caucuses. So basically the party leaders in Congress picked the presidential candidates. And one of the things to start out as kind of a definition for listeners and for us is the difference between caucuses and primaries. So currently caucuses are typically things that happen in Iowa, New Hampshire. Instead of just going to the polls and casting a vote, you actually meet some of the candidates or their representatives live. And it's not the same as it was back in the day in Congress when there were 50 people or 100 people, whatever the limit was back then, saying, hey, this is the guy we want. This is who we're going to pick. But they still get together in Iowa where they have some kind of representative talking and people go back and forth and end up casting their votes. So that's basically what was happening back then. It was just the senator saying, let's pick somebody. The first National Party Convention was the Anti-Masonic Party in 1831. And what I love about that is they hated the Freemasons, which persists to this day. So when we look at all those crazy History Channel shows about the history of the Freemasons and how they're controlling the world, apparently even back then they thought the same thing. And that party was actually founded following the disappearance of William Morgan, a former Mason who had become a critic of the Masonic organizations, which also sounds a little bit like Scientology. So already, Ben, on this episode,
Mhm.
I've talked about Scientology and the Masons.
Freemasons.
So Freemasons,
Yeah.
yes. So just for listeners, we're not usually into these conspiracy theories, but we just wanted to mention those briefly.
Have you heard of that the Earth is flat? Have you heard about that, Ray?
Oh my goodness, Ben, I have friends. I have friends who,
I know. I'm obviously speaking. Hopefully, they understand our sarcasm here.
yes.
It's early morning here, and I'm like waking up and just delirious. So, sorry, listeners.
Just to be clear, Ben and I talked once about how we can put percentages on conspiracy theories.
Mhm.
And to me, a conspiracy theory,
Like how much truth is in that conspiracy theory, like what the percentage means, right?
yeah, I think you can go a couple different ways. I think the believability of it, I think also too, for me, I think it's my surprise factor. So if, for example, we found out that lizard people ran the world, and I don't know if you've heard this conspiracy theory, you probably have, where it's lizard people that have come down, they're aliens, and they're actually all the world leaders. I'd be like 99.999% surprised by that. The only one I think I go to 100% is the flat earth one, because we need to have a flat earther on here that we can talk about some of these things in a way that I've never seen before, which is where they explain why, because that's the part I just don't even get about that, is why would we be hiding all this stuff? I don't get it. So should we continue on about presidential conventions, or should we just talk another?
Let's do that. Yeah, I think I was just going to say let's do an episode on maybe conspiracy theories through the years, and ones that actually came true or not came true, but were revealed to be true later. That would be kind of interesting.
Yeah. If we find out that the CIA had a hand in JFK, I'm at 50% surprised. That's it. That's a low conspiracy theory for me.
Right.
So back
I hear you.
to the podcast.
Yeah.
The early 20th century, that's when we really started getting the primary elections, which allowed regular voters to start voting directly for their candidates. And that's where every state still has different rules for delegates. And as we found out this year, sometimes when you vote, those delegates don't necessarily vote for who you thought you were having them vote for. That's something I think we can talk a little bit about when we get into this year's convention. But what was really interesting to me, as someone who grew up after the 1970s, was that up until the 70s, the primaries had fallen out of favor and were only used in about 20 states until the 1970s. And that's when most states ended up going to the primary system. And that's just really interesting to me, because I think we often talk about democracy and a republic, and we always have differing views of what that is as a population. But at the core of it, we really had a bunch of people. When you look at history of people like Kennedy and Nixon, it was a bunch of fat cats in back rooms, probably smoking cigars, these conventions saying, hey, this Nixon guy can win. Hey, this Kennedy guy can win. And a bunch of dealings and trying to get yourself on that ballot. And that's the way it was picked up until basically the 70s. And even today, if you talk to Bernie Sanders, you're going to find out that's still pretty much the same way it's done. So I think that's my wrap up, Ben. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think it is interesting so far. Just in, we talked about, let's do an episode on this just because we had done the conventions, but also the process in there. And I didn't realize that the process had changed over the years. It's one of those things that there's got to be a term for this. And if not, maybe I'm going to make a term for it. But it seems like most people, and myself included at times, right? We have this notion or this proclivity towards whatever's been happening in about the past 10 years, we sort of automatically adapt that it's always been like that.
Yeah.
Like the laws that we have today, the standards that we have today, whatever it is, we assume that it was the same 50 to 100 years ago, and our country looked extremely different 50 to 100 to 200 years ago. So it's a good reminder of the conventions today don't look anything like the conventions of the past, and even the mechanisms of them don't look anything in the past. And it's also interesting that we really hold I don't want to say them as sacred, but it's like we hold them in the same regard that we think that the founders did with the Constitution and the office of the presidency, and that's all evolved over time. Yeah. So it's interesting to see and understand that there's been an evolution there.
I would say it probably goes into recency bias. That would be the term I would use for it.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's this constant cycle that always goes through history in a lot of different ways. But you kind of forget the historical side and just go with what you've been living. But yeah, I agree. And I mean, the fact of the 70s, that was crazy to me that Nixon, Kennedy, a lot of the way they got elected was backroom dealing. I just figured it was because Kennedy was really good on TV and made Nixon look silly, and he was a much better looking guy and more personable. But he was actually still a lot of backroom dealing. And his father, of course,
Absolutely.
one of the kings of the backroom dealings.
The most recent case I think that you alluded to earlier that's in our recent history is Bernie Sanders, right?
Yep.
He was favored, and a little bit of backroom dealing, basically just pushed him out of the running where Hillary Clinton could take the nomination.
Which was interesting seeing him talk about that during his speech. I don't know if you saw him talking about how you can't have billionaires and leaders deciding elections. And he said specifically also, you can't have them deciding the primaries, which was, I wish they would have cut right to Hillary right at that moment. That would have been a perfect, like, if it was a sitcom, that'd have been the perfect pan right there.
Yeah. I mean, it's sadly, for better or for worse, it's still that organizational behavior of politicking, office politics, politics. And I think that happens on both sides. I mean, as the more left-leaning, I'm not a Trump fan. If the Republicans would have done some backroom dealing and said, this Trump guy back in 2016 or 2015 is a wild card and not what we want, we're going to throw somebody else up there who's more even-keeled, I wouldn't have been too upset about it, but here we are.
I think that's the difference between me and a lot of people. I get really upset about anything that starts the Kamala Harris pick. Is it a better option than Joe Biden? Yes. Does it give him a better chance to win? Yes. Was it done in a way where I'm like, wow, the party of saving democracy really looked like they saved democracy right there? Not really. And I think that's the part where, yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. I think Trump, even at this point against Kamala Harris, we talked about this when we talked about the debates. I think it would be great if he kind of got rid of J.D. Vance for his election's sake. But I would hate that as well if he did it just by saying you're fired, which is probably how he would do it, if it wasn't done by the right mechanisms. And I think that's the part that is frustrating. And going back to these conventions, it's become such a spectacle. It's become an arena full of celebrities and who can get the biggest celebrity. And we have, Kid Rock on one side and supposed to be Beyonce in the other, but Kid Rock is Kid Rock and Beyonce didn't show up. So I don't know who actually won that one.
Hulk Hogan, I think, won that one.
I will say, as someone who grew up watching wrestling, that was the best promo that he's cut in a lot of years. When I saw him rip off that shirt and do the, the Trumpomaniacs. I mean, whether you agree with the message or not, it was an intro. I mean, he was fired up.
He was fired up.
Did you watch wrestling as a kid, Ben?
I did, yeah.
Who's your favorite wrestler?
I was an Ultimate Warrior kind of guy.
Really?
I mean, Hulk had his place, definitely, but I think Ultimate Warrior was...
Wow.
Anyway, we don't need to go into that.
I love these sidebars, but yeah, I want to talk to you about that off camera and find out more about your Ultimate Warrior lean.
Who was your favorite? Yeah.
Macho Man, I think, was mine. I think.
Oh, Randy Savage. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I just think you've been snapping into a Slim Jim.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of the spectacle, we had talked about Zach Galifianakis, the actor. If you've never seen his clips with Hillary Clinton on Behind the Fern, I think that's what it was called. He does an interview with Hillary.
Between Two Ferns.
Amazing. This past week, he came out. He's a liberal guy, and he said, as a small town guy from North Carolina, I do wish the DNC would step back from the celebrities a little bit. It works to a point, but they have to win over rural America. Hollywood thinks it's so important, and that's a problem. Actors are people too, and they're citizens too, but I'm more on the small side of that than I am on the Hollywood side of that. What do you think about that, Ben?
I think he makes a great point, and it actually makes me want to highlight two other points that I think are even more problematic than that. But let me tackle that one. Which order do I want to do that in? So we'll do this one first. Yeah, it is problematic to me. I know. Welcome to the ADHD brain, especially in the morning when I'm still drinking coffee. So long story short, I would say yes, of course. A lot of the conventions have changed because of, politics has changed because it's televised now. Shoot, music changed because it was televised. Like there was the whole pre versus post MTV, who gets to be an artist, who doesn't. And I think going back to Kennedy and Nixon, there are some clear polls of when you did the Kennedy-Nixon debates, the televised versus the radio broadcast versions. Those who listened to the radio broadcast thought that Nixon won, and those who watched the televised version thought that Kennedy won,
right?
Or if they felt that he won. I think also there's some bias there in that you probably had older folks listening to the radio and would lean more Republican, and younger folks watching TV, there is that aspect, but they're very much a lot of what historians credit Kennedy's win in that debate is to, he just looked younger and more vibrant, and Nixon had weird makeup on for TV. They didn't have it right. So I'm digressing here, but yeah, I think that the televised aspect of those events has turned it into more of a spectacle than it needs to be. There's been musicians, there's been music at those since really early on. I mean, the early 1800s. That could be a great trivia question, actually. But yes, I wish that they would have the voices of regular, average Americans versus celebrities. And I think this is a both sides things. I think, the Democrats get the benefit of, there's more liberal Hollywood people than there are conservative Hollywood people. But, the RNC still had Kid Rock. It still had Hulk Hogan. It still had Tucker Carlson. I don't know where he's in there. But
well, Dana White. Dana White was the big one, the UFC president. He was the biggest name. Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
I feel like it's weird with Dana White on a...
Wait, the biggest name in the RNC?
I think from the celebrities. I mean, well, that's the thing. So you and I are maybe a little bit different in our viewings of sports. And Dana White was actually like a big get. And one thing that's interesting about him is that he is very vocally a friend of Trump's and leans right.
Yeah, Trump shows up at the UFC matches. And
also, he's someone that typically it's like you can't mess with him. I think he's one of those guys that just doesn't care enough that people don't try to cancel him or paint him as a bad human being or whatever from the left. It seems like they kind of leave him alone. I think there's some people on the right that do the same thing with certain celebrities on the left. But the point is, he's kind of come across unscathed. We think about Kid Rock, and people are like, oh, that right-wing guy, or Ted Nugent, or whatever. Dana White, possibly because he doesn't say as many crazy things as Ted Nugent, comes across more reasonable and more liked from people on different sides of the aisle. Anyway, point is, Dana White was probably the biggest name there. I just want to make sure that he got mentioned.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I would say that's a blind spot for the Democrats or liberals right now is... the UFC is sort of seen as like what the WWF was potentially seen as, and maybe there's a through line there. But like, I think that the Democrats underestimate the pool, or like how many fans of USC, sort of what that represents. And maybe like, I wouldn't say it's a big power structure, but it's a power structure in a younger dynamic, or has an influence on a lot of younger men in America. And Dana's been pulling strings behind the scenes, right? Like Trump was just on Theo Von's podcast.
Oh, yeah. That was an interesting
And that
interview.
was orchestrated by Dana. Like they talk about at the beginning of the podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't hear that part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. He said, it's actually, I think before records, I caught on YouTube, it's on, because that's the uncut version.
Gotcha.
So like if you go on YouTube, he's like, oh yeah. So, and Dana, because they're talking about how Trump shows up at the fights. And we're digressing again, but long story short, Dana, he is very much a power player in that younger conservative, I would say, male demo, which is a strong demo for the RNC. So that's a great point, right?
Yeah, well, I think covered a lot of points there. So can I just cover two of them real quick here? Because I want to make sure we don't lose them here. I think the Republicans generally would love the celebrities, but they mock the celebrities because they can't get some of those celebrities. So you'll hear that on Fox News, where they're like, man, they got all these people out there. These celebrities don't know anything. But soon as a celebrity comes out and says like, hey, actually Trump's pretty good, they're like, see, look, they're coming alive. And and they're usually people like, I don't know if Doja Cat was one of them.
Kevin Sorbo.
Yeah, Kevin Sorbo or Scott Baio, whatever. And it's like not these big celebrities, but when someone bigger comes out, they all of a sudden become huge. So it's like, I hate these celebrities until they're on my team. And again, Democrats do the same thing with a lot of people, but I feel like we should stop saying that. I think listeners should just know when we say things like Democrats or Republicans do this, we can just in the future let them know that we believe both sides does it.
Yeah.
But one important point that you stated there that I think is good is you talked about having real people there. And I'm a little torn on that, because what I see, the State of the Union addresses, I see as like a mini version of these conventions. Very short, but they have people come up in the crowd and speak. So instead of celebrities, they'll point out real people that have had these stories of ways they were helped or sad things that happened to them. I'm sure it's great for the people who are up there that have lost family members or whatever. It's good to be recognized. But at the core of it, I'm like, you're being used. And it doesn't matter which president's in office.
Yeah.
They're using you for your story. Maybe they care. Again, I don't like to ascribe intentions. Maybe they do care. But generally, it's like this person's going to be great on camera and make those evil Democrats or Republicans and people are going to see how terrible they are. And okay, you're done now. Thanks. I'll give you an autograph
Yep.
picture and you're on your way. So I think it's one of those things
Yep.
where
Yep.
all the real people I saw speak, they're up there crying about loved ones that passed away or things that happened to them. And I'm torn on that as well, just because it seems like a spectacle for the sake of politics. And I feel conflicted.
So that's a great point about the State of the Union. It feels both patronizing and pandering.
Yes.
Right.
That's great. Yeah.
The two P's. You're like patronizing the person who's standing up, and you're sort of pandering to everybody else by it. But I think I would like to see voices of the common person. I do think that that's important, because that's the idea, is that these parties should be looking out for the interest of the common person. And yeah, I think what I was saying before, the whole televised aspect of it does change it into more of a spectacle. But on that note, that was actually my two other points I was going to make earlier, Ray, off of that, was they both had the celebrities. I think the big difference between the two is that the Democrat National Convention had several Republicans speak. Kinzinger, I don't know if I ever say his name right.
Adam Kinzinger,
There was Kinzinger, thank you. That construction worker from Alabama. So that was like, the common man voice right there. And then the former press secretary for Trump, which you didn't have. And someone fact checked me, I don't think there were any Democrat voices at the RNC. So I thought that was interesting. That's like a strong move by the DNC to get voices from the other side to be on your side. And then in addition to that, I think that the bigger aspect was that we at least had the voices of maybe one common person, which would be the construction worker. The really insidious, and I'm going to use the word insidious, maybe that's too strong, but the scary thing to me on the Republican National Convention was there were 3 or more CEOs that spoke, which, if you're going to tell me anything about what the party is interested in, or what the party who they're really pandering to, I'm going to have the party that at least seems like they're, even if they're pretending, pandering to the common man versus pandering to CEOs. I mean, that's actually scary to me in the sense that, here's our spicy part, right?
Yeah, this is where it gets spicy.
Well, I don't think that any CEO should be speaking at a national convention for a political party. I mean, I think that's, and we've agreed on some aspect of it, and I think we're about to disagree on some aspects, but like the money in politics, especially from corporate, money is a major factor, and it's gotten worse. And I think it's led to worse outcomes. And, there's the whole argument of like, oh, they're both sides are the same. They're all pandering to corporate interests, right? And so I think that there is some element to that's true. I'm not going to say that the Democrats don't pander some corporate interests.
Yes.
Let's be honest. But I think that the fact that the Republicans were just like straight up, hey, here's some CEOs that we want, and yeah, we're in their pocket or they're in our pocket. I don't know which way, but that to me was sobering. And the last thing I'll say to that, I was talking to a friend last night who, full disclosure, my friend is a poet, author. He's Black. He's the guy you think that would be like anti-Trump, down with this guy, but he was never really, he's like taken the even kill. He's like, yeah, he's another he's a blowhard who's thinks he's a politician, But he was like, the first time the thing that gave me pause was his choice for J.D. Vance. Because he said, wait a minute, these are 2 business guys now. You've got a venture capitalist and you've got Trump. You got 2 business guys who are like, this guy's the mini version, versus Pence, who we actually have both said on this podcast have a certain amount of admiration for, even though I don't agree with much of his platform. He was that sort of Boy Scout. He was that defending the Constitution, principled guy, to me, it's that, just to bring it back, it just seems like very bald-faced, very apparent that like, yeah, we're about big business and we're about CEOs if you vote for us.
All right. Counterpoint.
Here we go.
I have a few things here.
Yeah.
Number 1, I'm going to start out with one of my favorite shows, Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
Great show.
Since we are a family-friendly podcast, I'm going to censor this quote a little bit, but Dee Reynolds was talking about politics, and she said she didn't want to vote because is she going to vote for the Democrat who's going to blast me? And you can fill in the rest of that quote with whatever you want to, but blast me, or the Republican who's going to blast me. Either way, politics is all one big blasting. And so I hear what you're saying in certain ways. And there's a lot of times where I go, oh, I hear you, Ben. This one, those Republicans you talked about, Adam Kinzinger, pandering. What Adam Kinzinger found out was he was leaving office because he got kicked out, basically. Voters didn't vote for him. And all of a sudden he's on CNN and he hates Trump and he got hired. So that's a great way for him to pander to a crowd and become a commentator. And that always happens with anyone who comes out against Trump from the Republican Party. And just for listeners, this is not a endorsement of Republicans doing the same thing, all of that. There was a sheriff, there was a clip from the DNC, which was really interesting to me. I'd love to find out more about him. I tried to look more into some of his speeches over time and only saw two. There was a sheriff that talked about how Kamala Harris was so strong in the border and we needed her in office. And there's a clip of him a year and a half ago saying that Biden and Kamala haven't come down. They need to get down there. There's 12 sheriffs with him that really need the president to do something. But again, it's one of those things where I just picture anyone on these stages to be pandering. And to go back to your thing about the CEOs and billionaires, that's the part that really gets me frustrated with political parties. It doesn't matter. I know that they're both being run by corporations. And it was crazy to me to see someone who's maybe not a CEO of a company, but someone like Oprah, who's worth $3 billion, literally follow up Bernie Sanders, who's talking about getting rid of billionaires, except for those billionaires that we like. So to me, it's like whether behind the scenes, those people don't get elected from the Democratic Party unless those CEOs help them. And if you look at corporate donations, that's another big part of it, where you look at the Silicon Valley and it's like 95% or 90% Google votes for liberal parties. And you can go on down that line. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, he gave $1 billion last time or something to the election. So
sure.
I think it's one of those things.
You have Musk on the other side, who's sort of playing the counterpart on the Republican side, right?
Yeah, and that's also going back to the point about celebrities, like with Republicans saying if they had these celebrities on their side, they would 100% be like, yeah, celebrities are great to use as marketing. And Democrats, they love the CEOs like Zuckerberg who give money. And then as soon as Musk comes out and says, I actually want to give some money to these Republicans, then that's one of the bad CEOs. But the good CEOs like Zuckerberg are on our side. So it all comes down to money. That's my point. That's my rant. And all those people that are on stage, whether it's Adam Kinzinger, anytime you see, and this is one of the problems I have with CNN, either they find people who are former Republicans who don't like Trump or the Republican Party and feature them, or they bring someone on like Rick Santorum was there for 4 years on the air. And I'm like, of all Republicans you should be using as your token Republican, that's not someone who's like, wow, Republicans love him. He's got some amazing views. And so it's they don't really give the best of the best. And I'd say the same with Fox News generally, although you and I may have talked about this off air and I may have said this on air, but Fox has a show called The Five, and it has basically 4 conservatives and 1 liberal person. And there's a Jessica Tarloff and Harold Ford that are on there. And they're both people who are intelligent people, especially Harold Ford. I love listening to that guy. He's very well-spoken, very intelligent, very reasonable, but also he's a Democrat. He ran and became a congressperson. All that to say, there's very few people in politics, whether they're on the stage, I think they're either pandering to the crowd or being, what was the other word you used? Pandering or what?
Patronizing.
Or they're being patronized and pandered. And so I don't really trust anyone on those stages. And there's, to me, the amount of money that's coming into both parties is terrible. So that was just a rant, Ben. That wasn't really, that was just, you got me fired up when.
I know.
Last thing.
Wait, I can bring us back.
You can. And I'm just going to, this is 10 more seconds. I think that's the big thing with Trump that Democrats underestimated last time. And I think has been an interesting shift. I think generally Republicans have always been seen as the party of the corporations. Like when I was growing up, that's what they were. They were the business people. And now I think that really is shifting to more of the common man. And I think that's become a big shift. And I think that's something that's going to be interesting to see over the next 5 or 10 years. If that continues, what's going to happen to these voting demographics? Because I do think Republicans are more of the working class people at this point. Again, I don't think they actually are. I think neither party is. But I think that's the way they're starting to promote themselves.
Yeah, I think that was, and I'll make this last point and I'll reel it back in. But I think that was talking last episode or a previous episode about the digital marketing aspect, et cetera, and the data that they used that no one else had. It was really the fact that Trump was the first political candidate in a long time to talk to the Midwest, Middle America, Rust Belt. He basically did the market research, said, hey, here's a large segment of the population that no one's addressing. I'm going to go do that. Not that I don't think he ever cared previously to that, but he's a smart businessman, marketer. And so
Right.
he said, let me do that. And so, but I agree that the Republicans have made that inroad to that part. And that's also why I think that Tim Walz was the pick, part of the pick for Harris. Number one, he's warm and fuzzy, which Harris is not, right? But number two, he does come from that area. He's basically a middle-class guy. And so that was that appeal to middle America, which I think both parties had forgot until Trump, I would say.
Yeah.
To a certain extent. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we agree on that. And I will say that after watching both of these speeches, I don't think either candidate went into much policy. I'm talking about Trump versus Kamala.
Sure.
But I will say that Kamala's speech, there's two things that made it great. When I say great, I'm not going to say it was actually great because I don't think it was. I don't think either speech was great. I think Trump's I actually fell asleep for part of it. So
he got a little rambly.
That guy went on way too long. And then Kamala was pretty short, which was actually nice. But I think also because she didn't really have a lot of policy that she was talking about. But it was there was a lot of hope and a lot of positivity in it. And we talked about this in the last episode about marketing. That's what I want to see more of in politics. Again, doesn't mean that I can't really agree or disagree with their policies other than the stuff about price gouging that we should talk about.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But the speech itself was much better. And obviously the press after it was pretty amazing how glowing it was. Bill Maher this week was talking to Caitlin Collins on his show. If you're not familiar with Caitlin Collins, she's a CNN reporter. She's actually pretty good, I think. And she was on Stephen Colbert this week. Did you see this clip, Ben? This week she was on Stephen Colbert and he started talking to her and said, so, CNN, you guys cut it right down the middle, obviously. And the crowd started laughing.
Oh, right.
And
not all the crowd, but there was definitely a sizable. Yeah.
It was a sizable part to the point where Stephen Colbert was like, oh, wait, no, that wasn't a joke. And literally threw his hands up in the air. I've never seen a late night host do that. And she asked, is this supposed to be for laughs? And he's like, no, I think you are. She was on Bill Maher and he was talking about the fact Bill Maher is a left-leaning guy. I think at this point he's probably more moderate just because the parties have shifted.
Yeah.
But he said to her, basically, I liked Kamala's speech. I thought it was good, but I didn't think it was as great as you guys did because you spent 23 minutes before you went to, I think he called him the lone Republican, to give some feedback. And I think that's part of the problem here is that when you watch CNN's coverage or the mainstream media's coverage of the RNC, all you see is Kid Rock and kind of mocking him as opposed to some of the speeches talking about policy. And on the flip side, when you watch the clips from on Fox News about the DNC speech, it's those clips about Oprah following up Bernie Sanders and Bill Clinton mispronouncing Kamala Harris's name, which I actually thought was not funny, but it was pretty interesting because a lot of Republicans get called out for that, for mispronouncing her name. And then Bill Clinton gets up there and massacres the name. And, it's not a big to do. I will recommend to listeners, we're not going to play it here, but there was a overview from Jon Stewart, and he went through and actually showed some of the clips. Did you see this one, Ben?
Yeah, I think I know which one you're talking about.
And he kind of put some of these things together. That's where the Bernie Sanders following up with Oprah and going back and forth, some of the conundrums that the DNC faces when they talk about some of their policies. All that being said, it is a spectacle. It does get a crazy amount of ratings for, modern times. I'm always shocked at how many people actually watch this. There's times where I think, okay, we don't actually follow enough of politics as a country. We don't really know enough about the issues, but I'm always pleasantly surprised people are at least watching this. And I wish people would dig a little more into policies behind it and force these conventions to talk more policy. But it has become something that is like the Super Bowl for Republicans and the Super Bowl for Democrats at this point.
Yeah, great way to put it. With that said, let's go back before the TV cameras, right? Let's go. I think, do we want to touch on really the change? I think you touched on it earlier, the change from like it was the caucuses of the parties and then the first Democrat convention and first Republican convention, which one was on the heels of the other, right? It was like the 1850s.
Yeah, so it was, I think 1832 was the first Democratic Party election, 1 year after the anti-Masons. And the Republican Party was 1854. Interesting fact, they were in opposition to slavery into Kansas, Nebraska. That's how the Republican Party got started. Held their first convention in 1856. And there's some debate about whether it was in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. So when you look this up, I think because it's just so old, It ended up happening in Philadelphia, but it looks like there was some precursor that was done in Pittsburgh, which is where Ben and I are from. The University of California, Santa Barbara said it was Pittsburgh. There's some other sites that say it was Philadelphia, but it might be a little bit of a mix of both. But either way, it was in Pennsylvania, 1854. And I think that the big thing with that is it started making that change from those caucuses into people being able to vote directly for these positions. And it still took a long time for that really to take over. And again, you can debate whether that happens today, but that was a big start to it. So anything you wanted to add to that, Ben?
No, not particularly. I thought it would just be interesting, as we're trying to research and do the history of things, to know when those two conventions really started in their more modern form, which was kind of halfway through our history.
Yeah.
Through the maybe a little less than halfway, but not too far.
At this point, it was halfway through the history when you and I were born, Ben, but now that we're older, it's a little bit before halfway. Yeah. Work that math out, listeners.
We were born like 25 years ago, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, 25 years ago. We're so young.
Old men.
One thing I would love to talk about, Ben, and I know this is the part that you're going to have to reel me in on because, again, I feel like this is, I try not to have rants on these episodes, but I feel like I've already had two at least. But the founding fathers' view on these political parties, because I think an important part of these conventions is the fact that they're the conventions for specific political parties. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is that the founding fathers in different ways believed either that parties shouldn't exist, wouldn't exist, or couldn't exist in the form they do today with two parties. Because James Madison thought that because we were such a large country and growing, it would just be fractured and there'd be so many parties, it would look more like what you see in France or some of these countries where
Italy.
Yeah, the leading party has 32% of the vote. And it's like, wait, what? That doesn't really make sense. And I think one of the things to me, this is one of my biggest issues with our national parks. I love our national parks. I think it's actually, and this is going to be debatable on some of my more conservative fiscal friends, I think it's a great use of taxpayer money. As Ron Swanson said, it's the one branch of government that's worth a damn. But one of the things that bothered me is when I went to Mount Rushmore, on the plaque for George Washington, each president that's on Mount Rushmore, they talk about their political parties, and it listed George Washington as a Federalist. And I was upset, Ben. I was really upset that they put a political party to George Washington because from the very beginning, he refused to have a political party because he said that would be a downfall of our country. And I'm just going to talk real quick here, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. There's a farewell address that George Washington gave when he left office, and Congress still reads it every year. It used to be read by both the House and the Senate. Now just the Senate reads it. But when you look at what he wrote, he basically warned against the dangers of political parties, said they would divide the nation, weaken the government. And I'm going to read this part of the end here. It's a little bit of older English, but I think it comes through. He said, "There's an opinion the parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep the spirit of liberty alive. It also leads to concessions to the favorite nation of privileges denied to others, which is doubly to injure the nation making the concessions, by parting what ought to have been retained and by exciting jealousy, ill will, and a disposition to retaliate in the parties from whom equal privileges are withheld. And it gives to ambitious, corrupted, or deluded citizens, the actual word he used, who devote themselves to the favorite nation, facility to betray or sacrifice the interests of their own country without odium, sometimes even with popularity, gilding with the appearance of a virtuous sense of obligation, a commendable deference for public opinion, or a laudable zeal for public good, the base or foolish compliance of ambition, corruption, or infatuation." And basically, he was saying that the political parties are terrible. People who are in the political parties were going to be the downfall of society because they are only worried about themselves. And Congress, to this day, still reads this. And it's just one of those moments where are they rubbing it in our face that they know they're getting away with this? Or am I reading it wrong, Ben? Or is there another option that I'm not seeing? So tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this warrants its own episode, number one, because there's a lot to unpack there. Two, I think I'm a little Madisonian here in that it's an inevitability. It just seems to be the way that I understand Washington's desire, and I think in an ideal world that would be the case. There would be I'm going to start singing Imagine pretty soon, right? Like there's no, like everybody gets along and there's no divisions and everyone's, just voting of their own accord and hopefully for their fellow countrymen. But I don't think human behavior is that. We tend to just find groups that we feel like we fit into. There's a modern sociological movement of the tribalism, of sort of the understanding or highlighting the way that people operate in society based on tribalism.
Yeah.
And so I think Madison understood that it was an inevitability. And so I in the same way that I would say that we were talking about in a previous episode, that the VP used to be the opposite party, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was the second place. And that sounds really great on paper, but really not great in practice. I think this is another one where ideally that would be great, but in practice, it's just not the way that humans work. And so you're going to have factions and parties. And I think that is somewhat of the best case scenario, in the sense of, we can argue the two-party system versus a multi-party system. And maybe that's the episode in the future, and how we got to a two-party, because we used to be more than two-party, to what you were saying before. But I'll just wrap that with, I think it's inevitable. And I think that the different parties being sometimes in concert, but mostly in contrast with each other, it gives that balance of, it's a rocky road, but we're moving in the right direction, I would say, as a country.
All right. So I hear you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one where I actually do hear you more than the last time I went into this rant. I'll just wrap up with this. I know Ben doesn't want me to rant for another 45 minutes. This is one of the points I get really fired up about. So I think this is why generally this episode has gotten me so fired up, because I agree with you on the Madisonian part. I think they were inevitable, but I don't think they're necessarily inevitable with just the two-party system. And I think that's something that really from the beginning.
Agreed.
Yeah. And I think from the beginning, and that's what Madison thought. He thought they were just going to be fractured. But from the very beginning, we really always kind of had two parties. We always had that third party, the anti-Masons, but that's a very specific party. And I think that's more of what Madison envisioned, was you'd have these people coming out anti-Mason or pro-Mason, or in modern terms, it would be the pro-gun control party or the anti-guns party. And so you'd see these little factions that had enough influence in Congress that they would be able to enact some change, but they were very, very focused. And I think...
And that happens in other countries, to what you were saying before. That's France and Italy. They have those, and they sort of fold them within whatever bigger wing for another episode. But
yeah, and I agree. I think, to me, and I'll wrap this part up with here so we don't go too far off and we can save this for the future, but the two main things I think the Constitution got wrong, and I think when you look back at the Founding Fathers, I think Madison
spicy.
was the closest to this. What's that?
I said spicy. Two things that the Constitution got wrong. Yeah.
My two main things. And number one, obviously slavery, and I'm not just saying that for lip service. I think that's something where there is a conversation to be had about, I wish I could see, we talked about the backroom dealings that happened with the political conventions we'll never be able to see. The same thing at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where listening to people who owned slaves talking about how they should get rid of slaves, but also keeping their slaves when they didn't get rid of slavery in the Constitution. And it's just like, where are those conversations? And there's really no great notes about what was happening, and obviously no recordings, but I would love to see those conversations. But I think clearly they kicked the can down the road. If they said, we have, I think 15 years, whatever it was, we'll come back to it. And obviously we see what happens. So I think that's obviously number one, the worst thing. But number two, there should have been something in there about some political guardrails for parties and the influence that at the time it wasn't corporations, but individual landowners at the time would have. So finding some way to put into our Constitution ways to limit the power of these large groups or large people who had money.
Aristocracy, in a sense.
Exactly. My last piece of this, I talked to our AI overlords on ChatGPT, and I pasted in what George Washington said in his address and asked ChatGPT to summarize in modern language, and I think it actually did a much better job than I could ever do. ChatGPT said, political parties will allow ambitious or corrupt individuals to betray their country's interests without facing backlash, often disguising their actions as patriotism or public service.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a really good... I think to me, I'm going to save that quote, and I'm going to use that when we do our political parties episode. And then I'm not going to say another word, because I think that summarizes all my thoughts right there.
Are you going to put that summarized version? Or are you going to do it like the Wayne Gretzky Les Scott, you know, like
Michael Scott. Yeah. That's going to be behind me for the YouTube viewers. It's going to be a sign behind me constantly. And I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to get shirts made.
right.
Thank you, ChatGPT. I think it's a great.
Yeah. George Washington, ChatGPT / ChatGPT. Right.
That's perfect. That's perfect. I love a good Office reference too. So thank you
Yeah.
for that. All right, Ben, anything you want to say, wrap up with anything I didn't cover before we go into some fun facts and some questions for you? I feel like I want you to probably bring this home with something that isn't so ranty so listeners can
Yeah.
say, hey, I learned something, as opposed to just listening to Ray sound like an old man yelling at the clouds.
Well, I don't know that this will not send you into another rant, but I was going to kick it off with another fun fact
Okay.
of when we were just talking about political parties, that the first political party by Madison and Jefferson was the Democrat-Republican Party, Democrat / Republican Party,
Yeah.
which is pretty fascinating to think about. And that was 1792, not long after. I mean, that was what, less than 30 years, that's 20 years after the 1776, right? So it was pretty quick.
Yeah.
But that's the fun fact, is there used to be a Democrat / Republican Party.
Yeah. And for clarification, the first George Washington didn't get into office until 1789 because the 1776 was all the wartime and all that fun stuff.
Right.
But
That's right.
yeah, so that was really right into it. I think Adams was actually he was a Federalist, and there were other parties that were formed before, but he was actually a Federalist, or at least that's, you know, he started getting some support from them. But
Yeah.
George Washington, man, we need to get a change.org to make sure that they get rid of Federalists from George Washington's plaque. And Ben, you did get me on a rant again, so I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop
All right.
and save all of this for that episode about the political parties.
Deal.
You ready for a pop quiz, Ben?
Yeah. I have a couple for you too.
Oh, dang it. I loved when I pop quizzed you, so I didn't look like I didn't know the answers here. All right. No ChatGPT. My hands will be up in the air for the YouTube listeners. We're here. All right. What was the first television broadcast of a national convention? The year is really what I'm looking for here, so you can guess a time frame, but the year is what I'm looking for.
Oh. I think it's more recent. I want to say it was, I'm going to throw this out there and it's probably not right, but the 68 DNC.
Interesting. You were, 1940, Ben.
Oh, I was way off.
It was, I was going to say you were close, but then I was like, well, I'm not going to say that, but I also didn't want to make you feel bad, but I'm glad. Yeah, it was 1940. Now, it was limited coverage, but NBC did televise some of the Republican National Convention, but it was the first time it was actually the public being able to see the political process. I think at that point, there were only like 3 stations though. So even though it was limited coverage, I think that's mostly because people didn't have televisions at that point.
Oh no. Television was very rare in 1940. Yeah.
All right. Do you want to go with one?
Yeah. I was just gonna say my thought process was, we were just talking earlier about the first televised presidential debate. I figured that a convention would come after that, but it came before that. So
yeah, it was a good, I understand where you're going with it. And I think it was a good guess based on that, but yeah.
You don't even make me feel good about it. Yeah.
I don't want any hurt feelings here. So, all right. Do you want to ask me a question? Or we're going to go back and forth?
Yeah. What was,
actually, I only have one more because I already gave away both the George Washington's political party and the longest convention. So I have one more, Ben. So you can ask me, pepper me with as many, but I have one more for you.
So I might not have this correct, but I'm pretty sure I do. What was the first, as a musician, right? What was the first known song used in a political convention and written for that before it wasn't the performers doing their songs? They were actually written for the candidates. So
Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Not bad. It was before that.
Really? Before that? Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, I got so excited I cut you off because I thought that was actually used in anyway, before
for William
Tippecanoe
Henry
and Tyler.
Harrison.
Yeah.
So we talked about him. We just talked about him. Are you ready?
Yeah.
It was for James Madison in 1808.
Really?
And it was Huzzah for Madison, huzzah. Which I want to hear.
Goodness. Yeah.
I'm going to go on YouTube after to see if someone has recreated Huzzah for Madison, huzzah.
Yes. I'm sure someone has. And I'll say this for listeners. Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 was from William Henry Harrison, right? I think you already said that, and I think that's who it was. Basically, there was a song that really tore down his opponent, and there's a really great cover by They Might Be Giants that they go back and actually get some of the original sound of the song and they try to recreate it, but it's very good. So listen to Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 by They Might Be Giants.
Which was also potentially, fun fact, the first diss track by a political candidate.
Yes. So basically in the song, I'm going to read one of the lyrics here as Ben intimated. For Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and with them we'll beat little Van. Van is a used up man, and with them we'll beat little Van. I mean, that is a diss track.
Yeah. Oof. Kendrick Lamar is...
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Kendrick was like taking some inspiration from that.
Yeah, Martin Van Buren versus William Henry Harrison. It's the new Drake, or the old Drake and Kendrick Lamar. So I'm sure that's going to upset somebody, me saying that. Just for clarity's sake. I have a lot of respect for Kendrick Lamar, less for Drake, but...
Agreed. Did you have another one?
I have one more.
Okay.
First, now, if you've watched these conventions, you see an amazing amount of balloon drops at the end. These rubber latex balloons that are just polluting our society, and it's always weird to see it from parties who are saying they want to be clean and clean up the environment, but they've become a huge part of this. And this is another one where it's hard to pinpoint the exact start, but it seems like, I read an article in the Smithsonian that they tracked it back to a specific convention. Mm-hmm. And what do you think that year was? The first balloon drop.
I don't know that I could pinpoint a year, but I'm going to throw it out there. I want to say it was Teddy Roosevelt, the convention.
Ooh, what year it was? Oh man, that's okay. What I didn't do...
It was like 19...
Well, no, actually, because it was the Democratic National Convention. So it was 1932, and that was the nomination of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Okay, yeah, should have known that one.
The slow president.
yeah, a different Roosevelt, but yeah.
Yeah.
That was 1932, so that was the start of the balloon drops for old FDR.
Mm-hmm. No one cares about the environment then. They're just...
Yeah. All right. That's my last one. Do you have any others, Ben?
This one's a fun one, another music-related one.
All right.
What band did John McCain say that he loved, and why he used their song in his 2008 convention?
My goodness, that's very specific.
I know.
Band that who's the one that did Senator's Son?
Oh, Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Yeah.
That's your guess?
I'm gonna go with Creedence Clearwater Revival just because of that. I don't think it's the right answer, but it's my best guess.
ABBA.
Oh my goodness. ABBA?
He used ABBA's Take a Chance on Me, which later when they pressed him, he was like, oh yeah, I'm a big ABBA fan. And later when they pressed him, they were like, so name us some other ABBA songs. And he was like,
yeah, in all fairness. Did they have any other songs? Yeah. So I would say that number one, that seems like a weird choice for someone like John McCain from just a musical selection perspective, but also Take a Chance on Me.
Yeah.
It doesn't really sound like a strong endorsement. I feel like that's take a chance. Could the other guy be worse? I don't know. It just doesn't seem like a very positive message there. So
I agree. Well, in concert with that, or in line with that, Biden's was "You Can't Always Get What You Want," which is another head scratcher.
No, I don't remember. That was really what he had.
I think that was, I think for his last he walked out to "You Can't Always Get What You Want."
I thought you were trolling me right there. You can't always get what you want.
Yeah,
that is crazy.
These guys, I don't know if they thought it was their favorite song. Yeah, both of those guys. They're like,
wow.
I know.
That is insane to me. Yeah,
we ended actually on a very non-bipartisan line that either side has terrible taste in music.
Yes, and what we always want to do here is both sides things, because that's what really gets people fired up. So yeah. All right, Ben. I think other than my rants, I think this was an interesting episode to kind of talk through some of the history of these conventions. I think they are giant spectacles. I think I wish in the future, I like sometimes talk about how I'd like to see things change. And this kind of goes back to our episode last time about digital marketing. I really would love to see more policy talks, more real people, less celebrities from both sides. I mean, Kid Rock, Hulk Hogan, Oprah.
Pink.
Yeah, Pink. I forgot about her. I don't care what these people think. And if I thought they had some really strong political beliefs or had some really interesting ideas, I just don't see interesting ideas coming from any of these people. So I wish they had some more people that might be boring. And maybe that's a thing. Maybe they have one night where they say, this is the policy night, this is the boring night. That would be great for me, because I'd be the kind of person that would tune into that and tune out of those celebrities, and that'd be a great day.
You and 50 other people in America. No, okay.
That would be fine, Ben. At least they can cross it off and say they tried. At this point, they're not even trying. All they're doing is trying to lean into those memes and misconceptions. So
the dumbing down of America, dare I say?
Yeah. Idiocracy. Yeah. I saw it for the first time about 6 months ago, and I thought, wow.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely, I saw it back in the early or not long after it came out, but anyone who's seen it, you go back and think about, especially the first sort of intro 20 minutes of it, and you're just like, this isn't looking so good for us.
And then fast forward to Hulk Hogan ripping off his shirt like Terry Crews in Idiocracy. And, just pretty amazing. All right. Anything else you want to wrap up with, Ben? Anything you want to add?
No, I think it was a well-rounded episode. Let's put it that way.
Right. I agree. And it's always good to end with some self-congratulations. I think we did a great job.
Just like the political parties.
Yes. Again, for listeners, we're not this arrogant. We're just trying to pander to ourselves. So great job, Ben. You are amazing. And I am also amazing as well. And
yes, right.
Now if you're not watching the YouTube, you don't see the balloons dropping behind us, but we just wanted to celebrate how awesome this podcast was. Please don't cut this one part out and use it against us. We really aren't that arrogant. But Ben, we look forward to coming back with all of the listeners soon. Once again, if you want to reach out with any fact checks for us, or let us know if something we got wrong or something you want us to talk about in the future, reach out to Ray at researchthenews.com. And be sure to check out researchthenews.com for links to our social media, podcasts, all that fun stuff. That's the hub for everything. And we look forward to coming back with another episode soon.